Woo. Everybody, can you say, yeah, yeah? If you're in the kitchen now, say, yeah, yeah. If you're driving in your car, look at the road, say, yeah, yeah. Hug somebody real close, say, yeah, 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 yeah. I see you. Can I be with you? Yeah. I want to know you. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Can I blow for you?
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to First State Memphis's inaugural, our very first speaker series event featuring Dr. Iheoma Iruka from the University of North Carolina. I am Dr. Candace Thomas, the Executive Director of First State Memphis. I am so excited that you all are here with us this afternoon and that you'll be able to hear from our amazing keynote as well as our panel. So I am officially welcoming you to our very first speaker series. We pulled this together because we want to make sure that all of us who care about young children, which is the focus of First State Memphis's efforts, have an opportunity to really think together about what do we want to see on behalf of young children. So I'm pleased to welcome you all here today and ask you that as you join us, please do say hello in the chat box, tell us your name and what organization you're from. And if you happen to not be from Memphis, to please tell us where you're from. I'm going to share my slide deck, which gives us a brief introduction to all of you and to get us started. So give me 1 second. That was our welcome slide that you saw. And we are honored that you all are joining us today. We know this is an important day for us individually, our communities, and our country. So we do really appreciate you all being here today on Veterans Day and honoring any veterans in your life. I am honoring my grandfather today, who was a part of the Korean War in the 1950s, and am holding his memory in mind. Thank you all for being here, especially on Veterans Day. So this afternoon, I'm doing some brief introductions for all of you, and then I will introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Iruka. After Dr. Iruka's talk, as well as a few minutes for question and answer, we will turn to our panelists, which include Commissioner Michael Whaley, Dr. Antonio Burt, Chloe Hakeem Moore, and Kelly Spillman, our trusted friends and colleagues from Memphis, and then my colleague Gwendy Williams will close us as we get close to 4:30. So as some of you know, and I hope more of you will be learning every day, that our mission and goal for First State Memphis. So as you know, First State Memphis was really created to hold and help create and solidify the early care and education system here in Memphis and in Shelby County. Our mission and goal is the community's mission and goal around kindergarten readiness and ensuring that our young students are reading at grade level by 3rd grade. And that's the work we've been doing for 2 years, 2.5 years in existence. And we look forward to sharing with you this winter our strategic plan, which will really outline our goals and our efforts over the next 3 years. This is our board of directors, and we want to make a special welcome to our board of directors, folks who are here today, including Michael Whaley and Antonio Burt, and also welcome any elected officials, and welcome and a special thanks to our funders and co-sponsors for this event. All of this work happens in collaboration and in partnership with our board, as well as our staff team. So thank you, team, for all the work that you do every day, and especially Joanna and Gwendy for helping to get us organized and leading our efforts to kick off the First 8 Years Speaker Series. So as many of you know, First 8 Memphis was really created to help align the early care and education system. So you may have seen this slide before. It just helps to define the 4 pillars of the system: home visiting, which starts prenatal; childcare, which obviously starts when children are born; pre-K, and in this community, pre-K is mostly for 4-year-olds, though there are some pre-K classrooms with 3-year-olds across the county. And our continuum continues to 3rd grade. So First 8 Memphis, first 8 is the first 8 years of life, and the first 8 years go up to 3rd grade here. And so our work is to help ensure that there is common metrics, ways of common improvement, public and private accountability, both to and from First 8 Memphis. We really want to ensure that all that we do includes young children and their families, because we know we can never do anything for young children alone, that any kind of support or help or intervention is about young children and their families. And so again, our goal is to make sure that children are kindergarten ready and all that that means, as well as that third graders are reading on grade level when they get to 3rd grade. Some of you know our biggest effort to date, and really the focus of our work over the last few years, has been with pre-K. And we are so honored to partner with all of you to bring us along this effort to ensure that the city of Memphis and Shelby County has a universal needs-based pre-K program for all young children, income-eligible young children in our community. So this school year, there is approximately 8,500 pre-K seats across the county. And First 8 Memphis has been really instrumental in the 1,600 pre-K seats that we have been able to fund and support with the incredible support and efforts of the city of Memphis and Shelby County government. And so while that has been the bulk of our work over the past few years, as I said, we will be releasing a strategic plan which will outline our work for the coming years. So this speaker series, again, this is our very first one. We're so happy to have you all. This is really a chance to build and increase awareness around early childhood, around early learning, early childhood policy and advocacy. Our topics may include child development, infant mental health and social emotional learning, the impacts of racism on development, literacy from birth, and how to improve pre-K and the kindergarten to 3rd grade continuum. And we're going to be hosting this series over the next 2 years. And we're excited that this is our very first one with you. So some of you may notice that if you're in our audience, that this is not a live Zoom event where you can see all of the little boxes of the 100 people that are on with us today. So this is a Zoom webinar. So the way that we can best interact with one another is via the chat box. So please use the chat box to say hello, again, to tell us who you are and what organization you represent. And if you happen to not be from Memphis, please share with us where you're from. And we will have time today for question and answers in the chat box, both after Dr. Iruka's talk as well as after the panel. Okay, so I'm so honored that Dr. Iruka is with us today. I have known about her work for a few years, and her and I happen to have the privilege of being on a committee, an early childhood committee together. And so when we were thinking of this event, I was so honored that she said yes to be our very first speaker. Dr. Iruka is the founding director of the Equity Research and Action Coalition at Frank Porter Graham at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. As you can see here, her work really does focus on ensuring excellence for young children, especially Black young children and their families. And she does this work through an anti-racist, anti-biased, culturally grounded lens, and she focuses on across the continuum of research, policy, and program practice. So we're so thrilled to have Dr. Iruka with us. And our panel that will follow Dr. Iruka, who just turned on her camera, is Dr. Antonio Burt, who you all know many of our local esteemed panelists, Antonio Burt, Kelly Spillman, Michael Whaley, and Chloe Hakeem Moore. So we are so honored to have you all with us. Dr. Iruka, welcome. Thank you for joining us. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that you can have privileges.
Well, thank you. I was just, I turned on my screen. I was just jazzed to jump in. And of course, I know for those who are in sort of Zoom land, obviously I love seeing faces. So of course it's hard, but I hope that you will feel the energy that obviously Dr. Thomas has already sort of exuded in talking about, First Aid Memphis and the work that her and her team are doing. And I'm so honored to really be here with you all. And of course, as well, happy Veterans Day. I do have some veterans in my family, including my brother-in-law, who's from the Marines. And so just, we thank them for their service and their work. So I'm so thrilled to be here. Iheoma Iruka, she, her, hers. And I'm going to just share a little bit, but first and foremost, I do want to thank Dr. Thomas and the whole entire First Aid team, as well as your community and the partners that you have, right? Because this work that you're doing around the first, 8 years of children's lives is hard. And we're fortunate to see some funding come, hopefully there'll be more funding coming from the feds to continue to support you all's efforts. So thank you so much. And of course, thank you to all the people who are taking time off to be here with us. And those who are watching after the fact, we're glad that you're watching, because I know there's way more people who registered than actually show up, which is just the nature of Zoom land. So thank you. So I'm going to share my screen to get us started, and knowing that we want to hear from our just amazing panel. So I'm going to share my screen, to sort of, give us a little bit of that. Let me make sure I share my right screen, because I don't want y'all to be looking at my other screen. So, and just before I jump in, while we were honoring Native lands, I also, while we honor the veterans, I also want to honor Native lands. I think for me, this is always important that we honor the Native land, just as a way for us to continue to pay tribute to the past and those whose lands we actually live on. I'm here in North Carolina in the Triangle area, and so I live and really work and build my family's wealth on the Lumbee tribe land that was taken through colonization and by white settlers. And just so you know, for those, the Lumbee tribe actually provides programs and services to all tribal members within the areas of Cumberland County, Hope County, Robeson, and Scotland, and sort of in the eastern, southern part of the state of North Carolina. And for those of you who may not have ever thought about whose land you're on, you can actually go to that link, https://native-land.ca /. You can actually just put in your zip code or the city that you live in or grew up in, because I think it's important that we have greater consciousness of Native sovereignty and cultural rights, because that's part of equity. We have to understand that we have to redress the past in order to really move forward and develop relationships and reconciliation. And so it's really important that we honor their ancient knowledge and their wisdom, and the fact that we are still on the land that was taken really through attempted eradication. And I also think it's important that we also honor Black bodies. And this won't be new to, you all in Shelby County and Memphis, right? About sort of the legacy of racism and the fact that many parts of the US, including here in North Carolina where I'm at, and also obviously in Memphis, Tennessee as well, right? So we know that many parts of the U.S. was built by enslaved Africans and their enslaved descendants, and only within the past generation were Black people afforded full rights. And the image you see right there's actually the image of the unsung founders memorial at UNC. Of course, there's some controversy because it's a small little statue and it should be much bigger compared to some other statues they have for the Confederate, soldiers and stuff. So either way, it's a little bit of a recognition of how much the enslaved people helped to build the university, but also many parts of UNC. But even today, Black individuals and people of color disproportionately work as service staff across the country. And, this community is largely responsible for the maintenance of our daily lives, from food and food service, early care and education, healthcare, and many other necessities that make our lives easy. And really the wealth of our nation, right? It's really due to the forced-free labor, but also the bodies, right, of these Africans. So we also need to honor Black bodies. And then finally, I want to just make sure for those who don't know me, you've never heard me or seen me, that first of all, I take all the Malcolm X what he says, right? That speaking like this doesn't mean that I am anti-white, but it does mean that I'm anti-exploitation, anti-degradation, and anti-oppression, right? It's important for us to realize that part of doing equity work, even in early childhood, is about the human rights, right? That there is an important value of human rights in the condition of ensuring that no matter your race, religion, creed, where you live, that you're deserving of full human rights that really centers who you are, including children. But I also want to let you know that the Equity Research Action Coalition that I founded, that we are actually celebrating Black Babies a month in November. So this whole entire month, including those who care for and teach Black children. And so for those who may be on Twitter or social media, feel free to do hashtag Black Babies Matter. And we will be releasing the Black Child National Agenda next week. Again, where we begin to continue to center the needs and protect and promote and preserve the lives and well-being of Black children and families. So feel free to follow me on social media at Iheoma Iruka. That's the handle for all social media. So for those who don't know about the Equity Research Action Coalition, this is just a quick highlight. Really, it's a collaborative at UNC at the Frank Porter Graham Child Development Institute. And it really focuses on co-constructing actionable research and evaluation with practitioners and policymakers, really to support the optimal development of Black children and other minoritized population. And as Dr. Thomas said, we really work at the intersection of research, program, and practice and policy, because you kind of have to if you're trying to really transform systems, whether local systems, state systems, and even national systems, right? And we must do that through an anti-racist, but also a cultural wealth lens, which means that we must recognize the systemic inequities, including racism, that exists, but we must also recognize the resistance, right, and the assets that families and children bring when trying to tackle the adversities that's created in front of them. So that's really the coalition. Feel free to follow us at Equity Research Action Coalition at UNC. So now I'm really going to dive in. So just in case your internet goes bad or something happens, emergency happens, here is my take-home message to you. The first is advancing healthy outcomes, and the outcomes we want for our children, especially in that first 1,000 days, 2,000 days, right? That it starts before birth, and those first few years really matter. And we must realize that racism and inequities are rooted in children's development prior to and after birth. That means that racism actually touches children before they're actually born. And if we're trying to advance equity, we must address healthy supports, economic mobility, as well as early care education access, experiences, and outcomes. And this is really important for first aid, right? Because you are sort of trying to create this system around the first eight years of life. And so it's important to figure out, how do we make sure that we build an equitable system where it meets the needs of children and their families, right? And to do this, I argue we must engage in a richer actions through both self-inquiry and collective action. And of course, in the end of it, there is no perfection, but the idea is that we must start somewhere, and we must continue to focus on, combating racism at all levels. So now, just to do a couple of ground setting, for those who may be like, well, why are we talking about, first aid? Who cares? First aid matters, right? This is the science of early development. So it's so important to champion the work that Dr. Thomas and the First Aid team is doing, right? Because we already know that early experiences are essential for building brain, right? The only way we're human is because we actually got brains that work, right? And not only is it important for building brain, but it's also connected to the underlying healthy development of children, right? You cannot thrive in life if you are not healthy, both inside and out. But we also know that early adversities from trauma to poverty and all these other sort of challenges in life can change the timing of critical periods of brain development, right? And some of this actually also starts before birth. This idea that we wait till children are born and then we do all that good stuff is literally not a good idea, right? We also know from our science that healthy development of children begins in the preconception period. That means before they conceived people, right? And so that's important for us to make sure that the mothers, even before they're even pregnant, right, when they're teens, during those prepubescent, before they actually are teenagers, let's say it that way, right? It's late in the day here for me in the East Coast. That those are important times. And then that supportive relationships between the child and the adults in children's lives are really essential. So those early care education providers, those teachers, those home-based providers are critical to both be protective, promoted, but they're also buffers for children who may be facing adversities, right? So this is all based on the science that we have to date. And we also know that there's a lot about the importance of access to basic resources, being able to have food, shelter, healthcare, right? That there's some things that are really, really important, both in terms of reducing the stress for families, but also ensuring that when you're able to sleep, don't you feel better? When you are hungry, ain't you hangry? You can't focus. Some of us, when we are starving, we just cannot focus. Imagine a 2-year-old. Imagine a 3-year-old who really their stomach is grumbling. You want them to come pay attention to you reading, the Red Dog. No. So I think we have to understand the power and importance of access to basic resources. And then finally, luckily, science is almost there to remind us and to tell us that both institutional racism and experiences of discrimination can influence the health and well-being of children and adults, right? We are no longer going to fight the fight that, oh my goodness, you people of color are too sensitive. No, we know that those microaggressions, those discriminatory policies and practices, those biases, they impact the well-being of children, they impact the well-being of families and communities and educators on such a deep level that we're seeing the manifestation of them, later on in life and even in early childhood. So it's a recognition that the systems of oppression, racism, is literally having some impact on the healthy development of children, included in the first 8 years of life, right? And we know this. Why do we know this? Because we have plenty of data that shows us when children, right here, able to have, high, access to basic resources, positive and promoting and enriching home environments, even early in education environments, they are going to start off well and be on the track, right, on the trajectory of better life outcomes, right? Again, it's not guaranteed because we can't control everything that they do after 8, because we have seen that, right? But we know if we don't start them off well, that the job is harder over time, which is why we say if you invest in the early years, you're going to get a whole lot more out of it than waiting downstream when children are older. In contrast, if children experience an economic insecurity, they're facing hardship, they're dealing with racism and toxicity, being exposed to lead and carcinogens and all these other things that early on in life, we know that has deep implications in their achievement, as implications in terms of their health. And so these things matter. So I really applaud First Aid for centering that First Aid as really important and a place for us to lean into. But it is important that we recognize that disparities start prenatally and after birth. As I said, we have a plethora of data. I mean, it's like a whole deluge, right? Right, from wealth disparities to income disparities, from poverty, food insecurity. We have a whole lot of disparities that particularly children of color, especially Black children, are likely to experience before they are born and throughout their life course. So the fact that you have Black children who are successful, that you have Latina children that are successful, is sometimes a miracle if you understand the level of inequities that they experience before they're born and throughout the entire life course. For example, we look at the median net worth of Black people compared to white people is at least 10 times difference. So we're talking about maybe $17,000 to $18,000 for Black families and close to almost $180,000 median wealth for white families. Remember, wealth is not your income. Wealth is what you have after you take into account all of the debt you owe, right? And wealth is what you get over generations. And if you see this flat line here, basically for Black families and Latina families, you see that it's pretty flat because America for centuries actually made sure to deny particularly Black people access to sort of earnings, access to homes and home ownership and jobs and education, right? And so that limited their ability to transfer wealth to families because they didn't have any. And even when they promised you, 40 acres and a mule, they took that back, right? So even the stuff that have been promised have been taken away. So there has not been a lot of opportunities to earn wealth. And this pattern holds itself across the country. I mean, in some instances, it may be higher or lower, but in essence, the gap between white people and Black people and other people of color is pretty significant, especially the Black to white wealth difference. And of course, we see this in our poverty level. So it's no shocking that, of course, if you have no wealth or low wealth, that you're likely to be poor, right? We see that in terms of, poverty, that, Black families and Latina families are likely to live in poverty, compared to white families. Food insecurity, the fact that we do see that Black and Latina families are likely to be food insecure, but also housing insecure, right? The fact that they feel that they're going to lose their home and not be able to pay rent. And this is viewed by this data here, where we see that less than 50%, more like 44% of Black people own homes. Compare that to a little over 50% now for Latinas, and then compare that to almost over 75% for white families. And this is pretty much this number for Black people has been the same since the 1960s during redlining. So again, when people talk about progress, we have to look at the data. And the end of it, if we're still living in poverty and still food and house insecure, and you still don't own homes, because we know there's a whole issue of mortgage insurance and sort of equity in homes and all these other discriminatory policies that are still in the books. There is no surprise in that Black families or have wealth issues or likely to live in poverty. This matters if we're trying to create a condition to ensure that Black children and other children are likely to thrive in the first 8 years of life. These numbers matter. And when we look at sort of even low birth weight, we see significantly that Black children are likely to be born low birth weight and also preterm, which is this light blue bar. And then compare that to our Latina, Hispanic families, right? And compare to our white families. And so this means that Black children in regards are really biologically vulnerable. Right, this is not a fact of, and let's get it straight. This is not only because Black women and Black mothers didn't go to prenatal care, right? Yes, there's some of those. Yes, we do have some disparities around prenatal care, but we know even when we take into account your socioeconomic level, we take into account your education and prenatal, we still see this low birth weight and preterm. This indicates something much deeper, and most of the medical field is really about racism and the biases in the system. And why this is important, particularly for first aid and others who are in the prenatal to age 8 space, is because that means that if you're low birth weight or preterm, you are predisposed to other sort of cognitive, behavioral, and health challenges. So that means that we have to budget the fact if you have Black children who are likely to be low birth weight and or preterm, we need to budget that we are going to need some early intervention. We have to budget they're likely to need special ed. Again, it's not because of the children's fault, but because they are being exposed. Their parents, their mothers are being exposed early, and they're likely to live in environments that expose them to a whole lot of other adversities, whether psychologically, whether chemically through lead and carcinogens and other sort of traumatic and biased experiences. And then on top of that, their mothers are likely to die during pregnancy, delivery, or postpartum. My mother lost 4 boys before or after birth. So I'm an example of that case, right? I am one of 7 girls. The girls survived, the boys died. This is a reality, right? So that means that we have a lot of Black children who are likely to lose their mother. And so this is another adversity that we don't actually talk about in our community when we have mothers who are unavailable for their babies. And we know the importance of babies being connected to their mothers and obviously, of course, their fathers in the first few years of life. That matters for children's development on so many deep levels that we don't even talk about. What does that mean for children's outcomes over time? And then we talk about early care education, and we do see this data that most of us knew before the data came out from the feds, right? That our Black children in particular were being thrown out of school. Like, we knew the stories. There were stories before I was even like 20. I remember all the mothers talking about, my son has been thrown out. And once the data from the Department of Education came out, and what does this data say? It says this: that Black children make up 18% of the preschool enrollment, but make up almost 50% of Black children who were either suspended or expelled. This is the number, close to 50% right here. Compare that to our white children who make up about 43%, and then about 25% of those who are likely to be suspended or expelled. So this means that there's an underrepresentation compared to the population for white children, and an overrepresentation. This is what's called disproportionality, right? And we see this all the time in a lot of our data, this idea that Black children are systematically thrown out from a sort of a learning environment that technically they helped to build. That is the history of early childhood, was built literally by Black people, right? From Head Start to all the early childhood interventions, starting actually with the enslavement period with enslaved women who were actually the caregivers of their enslavers, right? So that is the history, but then they get to get thrown out disproportionately, right? And this is not something that happens outside of Shelby County. This is Shelby County data, right? I went, because when I do my talks, I love to go digging into places that, I'm like, I visited, but I never really dug into the data. So I went digging, and there was so much, but the pattern still held that when there was a high Black population, there was likely to be more poverty, less high school diploma, people who are uninsured, high levels of disability, high levels of renter status, which means that there were very few homeowners. So this is a pattern that exists in of itself, no matter what. So look at this red shaded bar. This is a heat map, right? The more African Americans there are, Black people, AKA Black people, the more poverty. This is sort of the pattern. And so again, this is not to say that Black people are pathologies, as often written from forever and a day. Is the fact that there's a system at work that has placed particular groups in particular spaces, and we can literally track that the majority of Black people will lead to certain things. And that's what's called racism, that your race determines your opportunity or your advantages or disadvantages. That is why it's called a system. It's not about you calling me the N-word. It's about a system you create that even if I die tomorrow, it will still be here and function as intended unless we disrupt it, right? This means that disparities are rooted literally in our systems, in our policies, and our practices. It's not about how nice and kind you are. It is what is created. If we think about the founding of this country, right, we have the attempted eradication of natives. If you think about it, right, there was a Scalp Act where it basically was like, hey, if you bring, a native male's head scalp, you get $150. Think about $150 back in the day, in the 1700s. And if you bring, a child or a woman, you get $130. That was what we created. Even during the Constitutional era in the late 1700s, many of the founding fathers, they really didn't even push back against enslavement because they worried that the South was going to break away, right? So enslavement of Africans was an economic driver. The impregnating of Black women was an economic driver. Birthing Black children then was important for the driver, particularly on the South, but really the North benefited from that, right? And so even our Constitution, we have a 3/5 law clause that said, oh, Black people are worth this much, not even a full human, right? And so we have to recognize how deeply intertwined issues of discrimination, of racism are even in our Constitution, right? Even when, there was a whole Reconstruction period in American history, right? During even the abolishment of slavery, right? And ended sort of this idea that the South was going to succeed, there was still this idea that even freed slaves were not really going to be free, right? This is part of America, that even when you abolish enslavement, you still find ways to imprison Black people and to maintain Black people as a driver or some sort of engine, right? There was the Jim Crows that were established in the 1800s, really until the 1968, right? Where you have states, including in the South, where Tennessee and North Carolina, where I'm at, legalized racial segregation. They were meant to marginalize Black people by denying them the right to vote, to get jobs, get education, and so many other opportunities that build wealth, but also builds power, right? So we need to understand that there was a psychological, not just physical, right, with the whole threats and Ku Klux Klan, by the way, that started in Tennessee. But we have to recognize that there was a psychological exclusion, but also economic exclusion, and it was all legalized, and it was rooted in the system. And of course, and obviously when Black men in particular went to go fight for the war in World War II, and they came back and said, wait a minute, I went and fought for you and I don't get anything. I don't get to use my GI Bill. Then of course, that's when the civil rights, came up, right? When there was a fight for now, we need to make sure, okay, that those Black people that fought, okay, that we should give them some opportunities, right? And so, of course, you have civil rights. You have sort of, people started asking for more things around even early teen education. For those of us in early childhood, we should recognize in 1971, Richard Nixon actually vetoed a whole universal child care. So 50 years ago, we could have already had universal child care, not just universal pre-K, but a whole universal child care. But because who it is, people are like, no, we want women back in the home. We don't want to give these poor Black and brown folks money. No, send them back to the fields or whatever. This is our country, right? We're focused on crime control in the 1980s, the 2000s. We did welfare reform because we don't want those poor people, those Black people, those brown people to get all our hard-earned money while they sit at home and make babies. I mean, my mother and family lived in poverty, lived in the projects, lived on welfare and all that. And trust me, we did not get rich off of welfare, right? So that's what people who've never been poor, they realize, $300 is not going to pay rent in Boston, right? So again, recognize the disparities in our system, recognize that we are still fighting a lot of those disparities, and we see in our policies, from the cultural wars, the Muslim ban, the border control, chasing away Haitians on a horse. I mean, this is America. Again, I'm not indicating that everything about America is horrible, but I am indicating that the disparities are rooted in our system, and we have to pay attention. And so I'm going to just share with you a couple of data points from our report that the Equity Research Action Coalition, in partnership with Child Trends, released about a couple of months ago, that just shows you that Black families and babies are experiencing multiple adversities prior to and after birth. But there's also recognition that we have to lean in on the cultural wealth that Black families and other families of color use to navigate against structural racism and other racialized experiences. Right, from our data, this is data from the Rapid EC, been doing data collection since April of 2020, and this is through March of 2021. And across the board, even before the pandemic, Black parents experienced discrimination from, being fired, police mistreatment, to being called a slur, right? All across the board, right? And compare that to other parents, which is this sort of, these dotted lines here, right? And even after, during the pandemic, of course, when now we're wearing masks, now we're at home, cocooned a little bit for those who are able to, but we see a huge drop in that. But significantly, Black families are still reporting being called a slur, denied credit, being fired, mistreated, et cetera, et cetera. But that's not what's really important about this report. Yes, that's important, but is that even for Black families and their babies, they are concerned, even during the pandemic, this lighter shade purple, that their children will not have life choices, that they will be unfairly treated, that they'll be mistreated, that they won't have the right care and education, right? And that they would be discouraged, right? This is important, that this is for families with babies. And, I remember when I had my first kid, I was like, oh my goodness gracious, are they gonna make it? Because I know America, right? When you know America, right? Yes, there's some opportunities, but you also know America and some of the challenges, right? And that's what is coming through in this survey with our Black parents and babies. Even in our data, in our financial data, we see about 40% of Black families in poverty experience major extreme financial problems. This means that they literally are cratering, right? So this is our Black families living in poverty compared to our other non-Black families who are living in poverty, this blue side here. And yes, families who are living in poverty, no matter your race, ethnicity, or creed, you're always going to be challenged economically. But Black families in particular were definitely dealing with extreme problems and major problems. And even if you go into early care education, we do see that Black families who are living in poverty with babies really had a hard time finding early care education because they're working, right? This is the idea. If you think about all of our policies in terms of our supports, you always have to kind of work or show that you're working or going to school. But how can you do that when you can't find early care education because they're closed, unavailable, or just unaffordable, right? This is the case for both, Black families in particular, but also other families who are not Black who also just, say that they have, challenges with finding, early care education. Right. And this is what caused them to miss baby checkups and other things. And so we need to recognize that Black families, but also other families, particularly poverty, it's a huge problem regardless of your race, ethnicity, but it's particularly severe for Black families. And we look at sort of their use of early care education, we do see that they retracted their use of center-based care in particular. So this purple is pre-pandemic, and the yellow is the current right now. So you can see a lot of families across the board reduce their use, but of course, significantly from center and school-based, right? And even though that number, we see it coming back up a little bit as more things are opening up, that tells us that, do families go to center and school-based when they are in need of help, right? So let's think about, what do families need, particularly for their babies? And so just in terms of the key finding, I would say that racism and discrimination remain a concern for Black families, along with economic instability and access to early care education. And this is important for First Aid and all your partners. And we know Black families face, economic insecurity and material hardships. And we also know that COVID-19 disrupted not just families, but also their babies' healthcare and well-being needs. But we also know that what families try to do is they try to promote their baby's racial identity as a response to the negative concerns that they see in terms of racialized violence and oppression and inequities in the system. And so what we advocate for is for what I call the 3 Ps of, let's make sure that our policies and programs are doing these 3 things, which is protecting, promoting, and preserving. We need to protect our babies, our families from racism and discrimination, material hardships. This is necessary for them to thrive even in the first years and beyond. We need to figure out how to promote their economic security, mobility. America is not good at taking people out of poverty, right? Especially if you're in poverty, right? How do we promote health in many ways, our mental, social, mental health, and also access to early learning opportunities? And then how do we preserve Black babies and families' cultural identity? Black people actually have a language, people. I know we don't think that, but Black people have many languages and dialects. So how do we protect their language, their culture, traditions, but also their family units, as we know the history of dismantling Black families' lives and sort of their unit, including extended kin. So this is an opportunity for us, right? We're still in a global pandemic, right? Yes, we now have a vaccine for 5 to 11-year-olds, and eventually soon, hopefully the 2 to 5. But either way, we're still in a global pandemic, right? America could be good, but if the rest of the country is still struggling, we all struggling, right? And we still know that there's still calls for racial justice. And so what should we do about that? And so I will lean in on 2 of these reports that I helped to co-write, co-lead, really that talks about how do we dismantle racism in early care education. And for First Aid as sort of the pillar of ensuring, high quality early care education systems and programs, right? I hope that some of the things I share with you now really can be centered in your work, in your strategic plan, right? And so that means that first and foremost, before you get into the early care education space, we need to make sure that children and family are healthy, right? We need to ensure that there's health insurance, there's access to food and housing, right? There's preconception care, right? And other supports for families, before they give birth and after they give birth. But we know for a fact, if most of your focus is on children and families that are living in poverty, you kind of have to give people money. I mean, this idea that we're going to give you everything but money because poor people don't know how to use money is ridiculous. So we have to think about economic stability and upward mobility. And we see that paid family leave, income supports, like we see the child tax credits is having a particular benefit on Black and Latina families, and a minimum wage. Those are things that we have seen in the data that are particularly good at reducing some of the economic, strain for Black and for Hispanic families, right? So we need to attend to some of these things. But now let's enter into the early care education space, right? This is sort of the beauty of early childhood. Now, I think it is important. I'm so glad to sort of hear First Aid talk about sort of being able to create space, right? The access to seats like 1,600. And I think that should be applauded. And hopefully you'll get more resources to make sure that children who need it can access those high quality spaces. So that means that we have to ensure that there's equitable funding, right? This idea that we should just give money to just slots is really one that is not going to help to really ensure equity in the system. So how do we think about equitable funding? And make sure, even with those heat maps, make sure we're giving funding into parts of the city and the county that has historically been disinvested in or uninvested in, underinvested in, right? So make sure it's equitable funding. Think about how do you center family childcare homes and friend and family neighbor. That's what a lot of people with babies in particular and families of color tend to use as well in the first few years, right? So how do we center family childcare homes and family, friend, and neighbor along with our center-based, along with our school-based programs? How do we create much more of that ecosystem to recognize that don't just give me one option, give me the whole entree, and then I will decide what I want, right? And then how do we make sure that, especially when I mentioned that our Black children in particular likely to be low birth weight and preterm, we need to ensure that there's equity in early intervention. Black children as a whole are less likely to be identified. When they are identified, they're likely to get the resources, the high quality services and resources they need. This is the same thing with special education. They're likely to be identified much later identified in the wrong track, likely to be learning and behavior as opposed to autism or some other sort of developmental disorder, right? And so we need to make sure that there's equity in the identification and the support, particularly for Black children and other children of color. And so once you give me access, the experience had better be good. Don't just focus on access and then everything else in there is a little bit wonky, right? So that means that we have to ensure that our workforce is paid, right? Don't ask somebody to do a doctor's job because early childhood is a doctor's job, right? We think it is literally the most important time of a child's life, right? That brain development. So you're gonna ask basically a doctor and pay them $10. No, we're not. So how do we ensure that we are adequately compensating our workforce? How do we make sure that they're actually prepared and they are leaned into equity? I need them to know that racism is a real thing, that it actually impacts children, white, Black, and all the above, right? How do we make sure that the assessments that we use actually think about equity? Most of our assessments, I know sadly, did not and do not. But how do we make sure that that happens? How do we eliminate harsh discipline? We know this is a rampant thing. While it has reduced during the pandemic, the disproportionality was still there. I mean, how do you still manage to literally throw out Black kids during Zoom? People figured it out, right? So we need to eliminate harsh and unfair discipline. And think about if you have children who speak a different language, how do we make sure that they are able to access the actual experiences in the classroom, whether it's through the workforce, whether through the curriculum and materials? And then how do we ensure that our curriculum and pedagogy are culture responsive? Like, I'm not gonna get into the politics of anti-CRT, but I mean, there's no early child teacher I've ever heard say CRT in my whole entire life. But what I do need them to do is understand that if your curriculum, if your instruction is not representing the lived experiences of children and families, if you are not recognizing the impact of racism and discrimination on children's lives, then are you an educator, right? Your job as the educator is to be a socio-political action. That is a teacher. A teacher is not just about arithmetic and math. It's a socio-political position. So you need to prepare children for school and for life. And that is the idea of early childhood, right? And so we need to make sure that whatever access you give, it also has equitable and culturally grounded experiences that matter for children, that also integrates families in a deep way, right? Families are part of children's lives, and we cannot continue to sort of create these systems that says, why don't you just go ahead and go to work and we'll take care of your children because you're not doing a good job. That is antithetical to early childhood and to child development. And then in terms of outcomes, we must think about how do we ensure that what we're holding people accountable for, we've actually set them up for success as opposed to failure. What outcomes are we looking for, right? Yes, we should look at reading. We should look at math. We should look at social emotional health and executive function. But shoot, I want you to look at positive racial identity, because I know when my children feel like they are seen, they are heard, they are belong, they are confident that no matter what, even if a teacher says, you know what, you're not that smart. You know what, you are just too chatty. They will say, you know what, teacher, I'm not chatty. I'm just sharing my thoughts like everybody else, right? Like, you want to be able to create confident children. You want to be able to create children who, you want to also be able to support children who are able to also stand in a space of saying that I am going to challenge inequities and disparities. Who's going to say, I don't want you treating my friend that way because of their skin color or because of what they look like. We need to have those as outcomes, because that's what we need for human rights, and to ensure that we're not creating disparities in our early childhood classrooms, right? So think about the three-legged stool of access, experience, and outcomes, and they need to be centered in equity. So in my last sort of, as I sort of, hop off the stage, if, it's a virtual stage, where do we go from here? Like, what do you do, right? I've kind of given you this whole entire, story and journey about, US, the fact that we are bathed in racism, right? I grew up bathed, I would practically shower every day in racism, right? We all are. This is just our country, but there's also great things that we can do, right? There's so many that we are not in that space where we're at a crossroads. And what do we choose to do? And how do we choose to support and raise our children, who literally are the future of our country, the future of our well-being? And I say that I want our country to be richer, right? And I mean it in this way, that our country will be enriched by limiting the dehumanization of people and eradication of racism and bias and all the other isms and all aspects of our world, including early childhood, including our health space and our communities, right? Even how we do our policies and programming. And that could only be done by this. We need to re-educate ourselves about history. Now, I thought I went to the one of the best high schools. I went to the first public school in the United States of America called Boston Latin School. But I still found myself like, oh my goodness, I thought I learned everything. I learned Latin. I learned, trigonometry and everything, but y'all clearly forgot to, stop by the history and give me the full history of America, right? So re-educating ourselves about our history is important. And we need to really think about integration and not the idea of let's move the little black kids over to the white kids because it's better. No, we have to integrate who we are, who we work with, our resources, our curriculum, our educators, right? We did a whole job about desegregation, but nobody ever said, wait a minute, we got to integrate, because we know when children are with other children who are not like themselves, you learn so much. You're enriched by this level of integration. And we have to critique everything. Critique, is that the right standards and for whom and for what? Is that the right outcomes for whom and for what? Right? We need to learn to critique. Again, once you critique, it at least disrupts the continual cycle of racism. And so we have to critique and ask the question, but why? Should we? But who said? Right? We need to do that. And then for those of us, we need to have humility. Like the fact some of us got doctors in front of our names, we got a fridge we can open and get food, we don't have a leaking roof, right? We have to have a level of humility that not every family comes with that, right? Not every family is going to go home to their child, is not going to be able to go home to their parents or go home, period, right? There's some privilege that we have that we must make sure we extend to others. And we must always, to me, I feel like, if you don't focus on racism and sort of these issues, it's almost like, don't focus on everything but racism. Yes, focus on poverty, and focus on racism as your primary driver, because racism is literally the root of this country in so many levels, because it was the driver. And it's still the driver of much of our policies, including ones coming down from the feds right now, and even coming from your state houses and from your local governments. They're rooted in racism because that's just how we have lived and breathed. We see certain people as less than and not deserve it and not human in the same way. So we have to re-envision different ways, different policies, different data, different approaches that make sure that we are not repurposing racism just in a nicer way. Like, I'm not going to treat you like racist, but I'm going to treat you like trash. Is the same exact thing, right? So how do we go about being richer? And so I argue these are being re-educated, integration, critiquing everything, and showing humility, and erasing racism, and re-envision different ways is the way that we can do that. And so my take-home message is really that we have to continue to advance healthy outcomes, right? And early childhood is not just about education. It's also about health development, right? And those first days, those first years matters. And because racism and inequities are rooted in children's development prior to and after birth, we have to unroot literally that sort of sickness. And to advance equity in early childhood, in the early years, we must address healthy supports, economic mobility and stability, and of course, the three-legged stool of early childhood access, experiences, and outcomes. And we must engage in richer action through our self-inquiry, our collective networks, and really attending to combating racism. Don't hide and cower under every other thing to focus on. Yes, you can focus on disability, rural, urban, everything you can, but always center in racism, because that is the root of our problem. And I think once we really lean into that, we will be a richer country on so many levels. And so I urge you to continue on the journey, even if it's uncomfortable, because shoot, it's uncomfortable for me too. I don't want to deal with racism every minute, but it's what we have to do, because that is our job if we're committed to our children. So thank you for just listening to me. Thank you for being here. Feel free to follow me on Twitter at Iheoma Iruka. And of course, there's a whole lot of resources on the website of the Equity Research Action Coalition. It really just, hopefully that it's helpful to you, particularly First 8 and the Memphis community and Shelby County, but also obviously the whole state of Tennessee, because I do see some people from Nashville over here. But just thank you for allowing me to enter your space. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and if you have questions and comments or whatever you want to talk about.
You just gave us a roadmap for all the work that we need to do in early care and education in Memphis and Shelby County. So thank you so much. Wow.
Thank you.
It was amazing. I feel really inspired. I feel fired up. And I feel like, people who are in early childhood, many of us speak the same language. So I felt like you were speaking my language.
That's right, good.
We have a few minutes for questions. So I want you all to start thinking, do you have a question or two for Dr. Iruka? Can I kick off with my question and then we'll see what people have in the chat?
Sure. You the
So
boss, Dr. Thomas, so sure, go ahead. This is your show. I'm just here.
I have been thinking a lot about, and I think Memphis is the perfect place to do this. I've been thinking a lot about cultural wealth and Black cultural wealth in particular. And so would you talk a little bit, you mentioned positive racial identity as a cultural wealth aspect. What else do you think about? Because as you know, when we talk about success in early care and education, what I'm learning about Memphis and about Tennessee is that unfortunately, a lot of the measures will show that Memphis, West Tennessee, Shelby County will probably be on the lower end of the scales compared to the rest of the state. So there's a lot of issues with that in general. But to me, I want to talk about really how can we lift up cultural wealth, cultural relevance for young children and their families. So talk a little bit about that. And then I know there's a questions around inequities with child assessments.
Yeah, I love this is literally part of where the coalition sits, and we actually produced a report that looked at national data to say, look, we need to be able to walk and chew gum. Say for example, we talk about the fact that Black families don't read to their children, like 24% of Black families don't read to their children. Okay, but wait a minute, there's a data that says almost 50% of Black families sing songs and tell stories, right? So we have basically said, let me just use this data because it's really white centered. Again, if you think about the history of America, remember, Black people were pretty much killed so they would not read. Let's remember that, right? And when you look at it from that historical lens, but don't also forget that Black people are fighting and will also die to get access to books. We are the biggest purchaser of books, okay? So that is first and foremost. So I think we don't ask the right questions. And when we see the data, we always say like, oh my God, you look terrible. But we sing songs and we tell stories. Black children, and this is from my colleagues, Dr. Stephanie Currington and colleagues Nicole Gardner-Nebler, we have done papers that shows Black children have strong oral language skills, which means that they can tell a whole story. You could ask them about an apple, they will tell you a whole trilogy about an apple, right? Yes, eventually they get to the whole apple is a fruit and stuff, but they will tell you a whole story because they know how to tell stories. But teachers, we don't got time for your stories. We can want you to tell us an apple is a fruit and it could be green or red. We don't want to hear your stories. And so I think we need to recognize that there are assets. We either don't measure them or we ignore them. Here's one more I'll give you. Another data point is sort of like Black people live in crowded housing. Okay, let's take that. Yeah, but remember, there has been a whole entire policy back then that literally denied loans to Black people. This was federally legalized, right? Where we literally could not get loans. So all these people, white people, got money subsidized by the federal government to buy homes. When we got homes, we paid more for insurance and we paid more for the house. When we were about to sell, we didn't even get equity. So first of all, we don't even have access to home ownership the same way as other people. And then on top of that, we also are a group of people who love to be with our family. We actually live in multi-generation households for many good reasons, because we really do lean into our kinfolk, whether it's for childcare, whether it's because we just love our people and we like to eat macaroni and cheese, whatever the reason is, we still like living in multi-generational households. So there is a yes, we could live in multi-generational households that could seem like it's crowded, but it's also something that's also beneficial socially and mentally, because our children get to really embrace the roots of their culture because they have the elders in the household with them. So I think we have to look at some of these data and say, how do we tell the story both of the racism that has denied us, but also our resistance to the racism, right? The fact that you didn't let us read, but we are one of the biggest purchasers of books, right? The fact that you don't let us go to school, but we are likely to try to make sure that our kids go to the best schools as much as we can and graduate college, even though college does not actually get us the same outcomes as white people, right? So we believe in education, we believe in working, but those two things do not equate the same outcome. And so I want people to recognize that just because you give us access, the experiences of that don't always materialize to what you promised us. And that is the issue of America has yet to fully deliver on the promises. And so early care education, that's why I push in the end of it, don't just give me access, because systematically we see Black children likely to be in the lowest quality care, again, based on white standards. So it's even on your own standards, it's poor quality. So we need to make sure that we are pushing on the access, the experiences, and the outcomes. Sorry, I went on a little too long.
No, that was the answer we needed. I'm going to ask one more, and then there's a great question in the chat, but I want to save that, Erica, if you don't mind. I'll save your question to the panel. Iheoma, there was a question around assessments and racism. I'm trying to find it. Let's see.
So I'm going to be like this. Is assessment racist?
Yeah, Trina asked, can you talk about inequities with child assessments?
Well, Trina, you know the answer. Trina, you asking me, you should come on stage and say what you said. I mean, we know most of the assessments we have are really white-centered and middle class, right? It really is how much exposure do you have to whiteness, and how much exposure do you have in terms of resources, right? So we know that. And so part of what early childhood tries to do is, I'm going to expose you to white language, and I'm going to expose you to white-ish resources so that when you go to school, you'll be able to do well. So we do know that, right? But again, it doesn't mean that we should throw out the assessments. Is that we should recognize that it may be limiting our ability to see the assets and the skills of children, right? Just like the oral language, right? We don't measure that. We don't measure the fact of a Black child in a classroom who's having to deal with all this foolery from adults who don't like him because he's just a little Black boy. We don't address how is he coping, right? How are you coping going between two cultures? How are you coping having to go through, African-American English vernacular and then having to go to school language? We don't even ask, how do you just cope with being in America in the racist institutions? We don't ask those things, right? We don't ask, how do you feel about your own race, your own skin folk, right? We don't ask those things. So I would say, yes, we know that they're inequitable. We know that they're not centered on Black people or the people of color. The question is, how do we use those tools to say we recognize that, but can we expand the outcomes, right, of what we know are the assets that actually really matter? Being a good person, being a good human will get you far. And we know from our data that those social emotional outcomes, those social emotional health, like being persistent, which we know we are, persevering under harsh conditions, we know we are. So knowing that we can measure some of those things, I think we know for a fact that actually is a predictor of better outcomes, right? And so we need to begin to gather some of those, as they call it, squishy measures. But those are the things that really, really matter, right? Again, language, literacy, all that, yes, those are important. But we do know that these other social, emotional, effective outcomes are just as important, if not more important.
Thank you. Well, First State will be thinking about that and maybe following up with you and looking at some of the resources that you mentioned. We want to transition, thank you so much, to the panel. So that includes you, Antonio Burt, Michael Whaley, Kelly Spillman, Chloe Hakeem Moore. So if you all wouldn't mind turning on your cameras so that our audience can see you. We really want to, Dr. Iheoma Iruka gave us a broad lens. She made a case for an equitable early care and education system. And now we want this part of our conversation to really be about what are some of the lessons learned from her talk to us, and how does this relate to Memphis in particular? So if you all wouldn't mind telling our audiences, what is your role in the early care and education system here in Memphis? Either a particular role or work that you hope to do. We'll start with Chloe Moore.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. And thank you, Dr. Iruka, again, for just a presentation that means a lot to Memphis, and it is so applicable here, especially as we are a majority Black city, even if you might not always be able to see that. For me, my role in Shelby County's early ed work is running Next Memphis. And Next Memphis is a systems intervention for childcare, and specifically focusing on supporting the small businesses that really make our communities run. And so for us, we support a network of 42 partners, half of which are childcare centers and half of which are family childcare homes. And we provide services that help support them to have thriving businesses, help really do transformational work in the classroom so that they have high quality education supports, and then also provide wraparound services to all of the families in our network so that childcare teachers and directors don't also have to wear the hat of social worker, but can see their passion for supporting families supported with a full team. And so with that, we hope to improve the access, affordability, and quality in our neighborhoods, especially for Black and Brown communities here. So I can pass that along to Kelly Spillman on the panel.
Thanks, Chloe. And thank you, Dr. Iruka. That was really fantastic. We really appreciate you being here, and I appreciate being here. Thank you, Candace. I am the director of the Early Success Coalition. We are a collective impact agency housed here at Port Relief, and we work with over 60 agencies in the community to facilitate collaboration and data sharing so that we can look at early education outcomes on a community level. And we also operate a no wrong door approach to services. So basically we work to act as kind of a centralized hub so that families can come to us, whether that's through a referral from a community partner or just someone we meet in the community, and we can help them navigate the system, because we have so many programs here in Shelby County and they're doing some fantastic things, but it can be really hard to navigate that. It can be a little overwhelming because we have so many great programs. So we hope to really facilitate communication between those programs so that we can ensure that families have all of the tools that they need for a successful childhood and lifespan. And I'll throw it to Dr. Burt.
Thank you, Kelly. Good evening, everyone. Definitely enjoyed the presentation. Lots of rich information. And with my role as Chief Executive Officer for KIPP Memphis, my primary function is to ensure that students beginning in kindergarten, however, we definitely want to get back into the pre-K space because I agree with Dr. Iruka around, that birth up until age 8 is so important. But how can my role as a Chief Executive Officer ensure that the whole child needs are being met, both instructionally, but also from a social emotional perspective? So I envision KIPP Memphis really not only meeting the kids' needs educationally, but also engaging families in the entire community around ensuring that social emotional, societal needs are being met, but also educating the parents in the community around how can we as a collective group really change the academic outcomes, but more importantly, the future projection for our students. So with that, we're looking at really transforming individual kids and individual communities, primarily the community, the zip code within the North Memphis area, as far as one that's a one-stop shop from early childhood to college to post-secondary success as well. And with that, I'll turn it over to Commissioner Whaley.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Iruka, for that presentation. I'm Michael Whaley. First and foremost, serve on the First Aid Board of Directors. So my main role is to try to support Dr. Thomas with everything she needs to continue doing a fantastic job on behalf of the organization. I also, since 2018, have served as a member of the Shelby County Board of Commissioners, which is our local governing body in Shelby County. And so, one of the things that I've learned in that role since 2018 is the importance of policy and policy change. That often, it's quite, for some, it's difficult to even talk about inequity. But once you can get to the conversation of talking about what currently exists, it's often very difficult to transform that into actual policy. So that's something that is very interesting to me, not only as it relates to early childhood education, but how we ensure that there are policies across the board that are all connected to families in our community that help ensure that we can get to a place of equity across our community. So excited to be here with such a stellar panel, yeah, all right, appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you all. Dr. Iruka really talked about inequities. Obviously, she reminded us all that, the America as it is was founded with roots of inequity, and that it continues to today and it impacts every single one of us, all of us, regardless of class, race, ethnicity, nationality in this country. So as we think about the Memphis and Shelby County early care and education system and some of the work that you all have done, have you been able to implement any particular strategies to address inequities in your work?
Yeah, I can start. So I would say that our work is addressing inequities. And I think when you look at childcare in Shelby County, you'll find that most of these small businesses are run by Black women. In fact, out of our 42 partners, 95% of our partners are Black women. And then there's 2% that are Black men. And so when you see the majority of these businesses being run by Black women, it then makes the system level challenges in the industry unavoidable to assess by racial and gendered and class disparities. So for example, I just came from the state, Nashville, talking about what the minimum or the average wage is, and it's $11 an hour in childcare as the state average. And when you think about the professionals in the industry who are doing this work, and in Memphis being predominantly Black women, you see people who are doing a critical service, Black women who are providing a critical service in the community and being paid less than they would make at a McDonald's or at a Chick-fil-A. You also see these women being responsible with running a business, providing instruction in classrooms, being social workers to families who really need a lot of support. And that's just at the professional level, again, at on average $11 an hour, and in Memphis it's often lower, for small businesses who are not connected to like Head Start funding or larger, more sustainable funding sources. So for private businesses, you see a lot of challenges, and they have implications for communities. So of the programs that do function and do run, there have been childcare programs and childcare leaders in Shelby County who, again, outside of the larger systems, have been doing this work for decades and have been doing advocacy work for decades. And so for our work to even support them and to support, I saw Trina on the call. I don't know if Dr. Palmer's here, but there are some titans in our space who have been doing this work who are amazing Black women. And our work is to carry on the work they've already started, but to also expand that. I could talk all day about this, but one small thing I like to focus on is that our work, which is about $32 million of effort, gets to our partners at virtually no cost to them. It's a way of redistributing wealth into small businesses, whereas they would not be able to operate at that level without that capital. It's also about making sure that with that significant investment in their programs, we don't take any ownership whatsoever. So we will never own their programs. We will never buy them, even though some people have asked us to buy the programs, and making sure that childcare business owners keep ownership and get additional resources is about making sure that ownership is a piece of equity. It's not just, hey, let's make sure people have jobs. Hey, let's make sure people can own businesses. And I think that's a really important part of our model.
All right, anyone else? Go ahead, Kelly.
I can talk a bit about the ESC's work. So in this field, we talk a lot about equitable access to services, but I think it's so important to remember that there's a difference in accessibility and availability. If you're not putting top of mind, transportation, work hours, all of these different barriers that can make it hard to get to services, then you're going to miss out on a huge portion of the population. So with the ESC, we focus a lot on meeting parents where they are. A big part of our work is working with home visiting programs, which is when a trained nurse or paraprofessional can actually go into the home to provide parenting supports. They can help families navigate different resources in the community, offer tips and support on parenting, and really walk beside them and just act as a non-judgmental support and partner in parenting. Another one of our initiatives is we partner with the University of Memphis to operate an integrated behavioral health model in pediatric clinics. So we work with 3 clinics right now, and we're actually able to place infant mental health specialists in those clinics so that when parents are already at the clinic to take their child for a well child visit, do the regular checkups on your physical health, we're also able to offer brief interventions and screenings for behavioral health and looking at relational well-being between the parent and child, and offer different supports and offer that really important emotional and behavioral well-being support while they're already there in the doctor's office. So again, we work on just meeting parents where they are and making things not just available but accessible.
And I can add to that also, Candace. My approach around inequity is a little different from the other panelists, considering my sphere was like K-12, but thinking about it from an inequity standpoint and aligning with what was discussed in the presentation around a lot of historical context. In the previous role, there was a lot of inequities around students of color in certain zip codes being exposed to opportunities in regard to rigorous course offerings, i.e. Advanced placement courses, international baccalaureate programs, and also students of color being accepted into the CLU, which is creative learning in a unique environment, which leads to gifted programs. So just like we heard in the presentation, a lot of inequities have long-standing historical context, where it was started to really have a through line around still segregating, having classes not integrated. So in a previous role, implementing universal screening to ensure that a recommendation from adult didn't deny a kid to the access to CLU, but more importantly, how they performed on the actual assessment. And every student got the opportunity to take the assessment, and then based on the score, they were either accepted or denied into CLU based on their score, not the adult recommending them. And also looking at expanding AP courses across the district and not just letting the courses be determined based on individuals' perception on how that school will perform. So it ties, directly into what we heard in the presentation around opportunity, but also the historical context. And I think that speaks to the work that First Aid is doing and other partners, Porter Leith, around starting from birth, getting kids on the right track to really be able to walk into the K-12 space prepared to be successful, but more importantly, go throughout the different phases to really achieve their overall success.
All right, Commissioner Whaley, do you happen to want to add to that, or should we move on to audience questions?
Yes, you might hear my dog barking in the background at the worst possible time. She was so good until just now. So one thing I'll add that I think, that we're probably most proud of on the county is the joint county city ordinance that we passed in 2019, which is important for a few reasons. One is, if you do an ordinance, it's hard to undo it. So it's important to note that, politicians come and go, and tides turn quite quickly. And so if, you really want to strike while you can and codify things in the law. And so an ordinance, once you pass it, takes a supermajority to change. And so we passed one that was a joint commitment primarily around funding, because ultimately this work is very difficult to do without sustainable funding sources. Many people on this call are supporters of early childhood education through philanthropic, sources or foundations that have always been there, but they would say also that you've got to be able to have your local government support the work that you're doing for it to be sustainable. So we went from spending on average around $3 million a year on pre-K specifically to now over $8 million just for the county. And that's something that, again, we hope to continue to be able to provide that support. So I think being able to think about ways in which we can, as I mentioned earlier, create policies that both support the funding mechanisms for the work, but also make sure that we're finding the right partners that have the right strategy to be able to execute it, because ultimately that'll build more support for it if it's successful and we have great people and great leadership in these different programs.
Thank you. I was thinking of the universal needs-based pre-K program here as an amazing example of an equitable system, like intentionally putting dollars to make sure that income eligible students have access to pre-K. So perfect, thank you. We have a couple of questions in the chat that I will ask Dr. Iruka to also turn on your camera, and we'll ask all of you to chime in to some of the questions we have. One question that I promised Erica that I would come back to this. She says she's thinking about challenges Black educators face in the current pre-K to 12 system and how the future could bring us, and what the future could bring us as we expand pre-K and universal childcare. So she's wondering, how can we empower Black educators as the country looks to design a universal childcare and pre-K system?
Okay, I'll try to go first. Erica, I think that is a great question, right? And I always go back to my history. Remember when the whole desegregation order happened, and before then, Black teachers weren't teaching Black children. Once that desegregation order happened, what happens? A lot of the teachers actually were either given lower level jobs or never given a job at all. That created a whole loss of Black teachers. And I, like you, actually do worry a little bit if we build our universal pre-K on our current universal, on our current pre-K principles, right? Because a lot of them are situated in the school sort of credentialing. And that means that a lot of Black teachers, and even our dual language teachers, Latina teachers, our Indigenous teachers, a lot of them may not be able to get certified or credentialed. And so basically a lot of the money comes into the pre-K will literally ensure that Black teachers, brown teachers will not make it in unless we ensure that the credential system is equitable, which we'll leave it to those who are in that space. Maybe Antonio could speak to that. So this is where I think it's important for us to think about what is the foundation that we're building our pre-K in, right? Because the universal pre-K is not the same as universal childcare, right? Though I feel like if we build our system, at least under the Head Start sort of, performance standards, right? That really thinks about not the whole child, but also the community, and also thinks about that we need to also make sure that the workforce is also supported. Then I think we may be in a space where we can build a more equitable system. So basically your Head Start becomes your foundation, then you can build and layer on your pre-K. I do think that we have to also make sure that we understand that Black teachers and Latino and brown teachers are not just for Black and brown kids, it's also for white kids. I know this idea that that Black teachers and having them just for Black kids is not something that we should continue to sort of perpetuate. Yes, that is important because we do see they do have better outcomes in terms of achievement gap, in terms of engagement, but we know that white children also benefit because then they have stronger critical thinking skills, they have stronger social emotional skills, so everybody benefits. And so I do think if we want a much more of an educated sort of workforce across the board, we're gonna have to figure out the diversity of our workforce, both in pre-K through 12, but also making sure that we pay and compensate our early child teachers like we do our pre-K to K to 12 teachers. So it's really about how much do you value a teacher and how much do you value Black and brown teachers.
I would also offer that one thing I think a lot about with educators, especially Black teachers, is the stress levels of what it means to be an educator. I think that, I don't know how many of you have ever spent more than 30 minutes in a room full of toddlers, but it is enough to, like, y'all are laughing, it is so stressful. The one toddler thinks you are the teacher's their whole world and vice versa, and they need your attention, they need it now, they don't understand why there are other humans that get your attention too. So even just that alone, dealing with little ones is necessarily consuming, like it takes a lot. And the realities of being an early childhood teacher are often you don't get time off the floor, so you don't get paid planning time. You don't get time as a mental health break to step away after a child has thrown a tantrum, maybe smacked you around, yelled at you, pulled another student's hair, like going through all the motions. Oftentimes the planning support, like there's so much on a teacher's plate that it's difficult to do the job. I would also offer that when you deal with larger stressors such as systemic racism, such as poverty, we have teachers who have told me that they drive Uber to make ends meet, right? And they want to stay in their role as an educator, but have financial obligations as well. It's really stressful to do this job. And so when you think about what it means to have a livable profession, it's beyond just compensation. I think it's also beyond just getting more teachers in the field. I think it's also, how do we care for teachers? How do we recognize the larger context that they have to navigate, especially when you have multicultural and multi-ethnic, multiracial sites? And so thinking of even the dynamics of, if you have parents who hold biases and teachers who are across cultures, how do you support a teacher who has bigotry, or navigating bigotry is now part of their role, even if it's not something we want to formally address? And so I think that understanding the larger context that teachers have to navigate is one of the first steps we have to mitigating burnout, mitigating the loss of teachers. And even, sometimes people say we have a recruitment issue for getting teachers in the field. The reason we have a recruitment issue is because they could make more at Chick-fil-A or McDonald's, and have significantly less stressful jobs. And that does not even account for all of the systemic challenges that they have to face on top of just educating children. So when I think about the challenges Black teachers face, I think it's the same challenges that you see Black folks face in our country, that plus the challenges of being an educator for little ones and managing the high expectations of parents who are very stressed out about their little ones not being in their direct care 24/7.
Absolutely. Thank you, both of you. I'll ask one more question from our audience. This is from Carol Johnson Dean. What is the role of higher education in helping improve quality care and education for young students and young people? Any thoughts about that?
I'll jump in. So I think when we're talking about workforce development and getting those high quality educators, there's a lot of great strategies happening in Memphis. I think those partnerships and research partnerships between organizations and higher education can be so valuable. We've seen it in our partnership with the University of Memphis, where we place master's level social work interns into pediatric clinics. And through that, we're not just offering an internship, we're trying to raise awareness of infant and early childhood mental health and build a workforce that is well equipped to handle and navigate every aspect of early childhood. I think there's some opportunities to increase awareness of some of the lesser known fields, such as home visiting. There are a lot of colleges and universities that have home visiting certifications that are available to their students. We'd love to see that happen here in Shelby County. And again, just continuing to provide financial support and social emotional support and mental health services to those students as they prepare to take on what is, as we've talked about, a really, really challenging role. So, yeah.
Thank you. I'm realizing that we're almost close to time, and the hour and a half went by so quickly. So if you wouldn't mind, if you have, let's end with closing remarks, and then I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Wendy to close us out today. Any closing thoughts or remarks or hopes for our early care and education system in Shelby County?
I'd offer a hope that I have that's really personal, is that I hope people recognize how important economic opportunity, dismantling racist and oppressive systems, and high quality early education interventions all play hand in hand. I don't think that early childhood in isolation, and some early childhood folks would fight me on this. I don't think early childhood education in isolation is the answer, but without it, we don't have an answer. And so I really think that understanding and significantly underscoring the importance of prenatal all the way through 8 years old as a continuum that can't be overlooked has to be at the table for any effort to try to improve our society, or else there's going to be a significantly missing chunk of the equation.
And I would just build upon that. I think, my hope would be that the momentum that has been established is, definitely continued, but also that we have a very strategic and aligned approach that involves, both public sector, private sector, elected officials, and higher ed to develop a true comprehensive plan that addresses those systemic challenges that live in each of those different group spheres. But more importantly, think about how does it transform generational issues that have plagued the city and county for particular ethnic groups, and what does it look like to have a comprehensive plan to eradicate those challenges that we know that exist.
Yeah, just to sort of illustrate, that we talked about the racial wealth gap, and just to illustrate that, even just for county government, Shelby County government, there was a disparity study that was done that showed, between just 2012 and 2014, Black-owned businesses should have, just based on availability of contractors and businesses, should have received about $53 million of business, ended up only receiving about 11. And so, if you've got that issue, right, which I think, to Chloe's point, is not disconnected from early childhood, that these are still families who work, who provide for their families, who have small businesses. And so we've got to find ways to be able to, support our own community, because that is what helps us be able to break these cycles of generational poverty that are very clearly disproportionately affecting Black families and Black people in Shelby County. And it's not just here, it's certainly across the country, but we've got to look at it holistically. And to Dr. Burt's point, we've got to be on the same page. Like, how do we make sure that we're talking to each other across all stakeholders to make sure that we have a common vision and a common goal? But it gives me hope that we have conversations like these with those very stakeholders at the table to be able to do it. And that hasn't been the case here. And that hasn't been the case in many communities across the country. So it's exciting to be able to see it, to be, a small part of it. And it makes me hopeful for the future.
All right, so I'm going to close us out. Another big thank you to Dr. Iruka, Commissioner Whaley, Chloe Moore, Kelly Spillman, Dr. Burt. Thank you all for your time and expertise today. I'm going to share my screen. I do want to invite you all to join us next time. Our next First 8 Year Speaker Series will be February 24th. Dr. Chandra Gush-Epin will join us, and we will focus on how we build an equitable early care and education system centering on children's mental health and trauma. So please join us. We will have information on that session in our December newsletter. And I want to give a big thank you to all of you who stayed around. Thank you for staying a few extra minutes. You can scan the QR code or find the link to the survey that we'd like for you to take. It's just a quick, short survey. So you can scan the QR code or find the link in the chat. And also, just a second, for those of you who stuck around through the end, we are going to do a raffle. Are you able to see my screen? Okay. So we're going to click to spin. Let's see who will be the winner of a First 8 Memphis swag bag. All right, Nicolette Thompson, you are our winner. If you can just put your, send your email to the host and panelist, Joanna, my colleague Joanna will coordinate with you to get that bag to you. And again, thank you, everyone. Thank you to our commission, to our panelists, to Dr. Iruka, and thank you for everyone who attended today. We hope we'll see you again in February. Bye.